Hi everyone, welcome to week 9. This week we're going to be discussing together artography as a research method and as a pedagogical endeavor, and how artography might be situated within our processes of living inquiry. So artography is a visual, artistic, and pedagogical form of research that considers thought as it emerges in the making and in the doing of something. So here, thought is not considered as something separate or something that happens before or after an event, but rather theory and thinking is made in the moments of doing something, in the processes of making. So research in this way is an act of creation. The creation itself is research. The process is the research. So it's a bodied, haptic, sensational way of generating knowledge, of figuring something out. So here our methods are our artistic practices. The photos that I've included in these slides this week make visible some of the artistic processes that have been happening here in Ecuador, particularly of weaving here in the Andes as an artistic practice. So here, the method of research is weaving. Weaving is the method. It's an embodied, enacted, creative method that situates thinking and theorizing in the act of doing. So artography situates research, creating, and thinking doing as an interdependent event. That is, it considers research as a speculative practice in the making that seeks to do theory as performative, experimental, and bodied. Central to its purpose and premise is the notion that art constitutes research in its own right. So it's not an add-on or a supplement or such that data should be analyzed afterward, but here the artistic process is the data, the method, and the analysis. It's a lived, felt process of figuring something out. So the intersections of art, research, and teaching are acts of inquiry in research and in pedagogy, where the arts are central in questioning, thinking, and gathering meaning. So art is not in reference to a particular skill, painting, or a conventional image of art, but rather the arts are acts of making, a way of thinking through something that is artful, otherwise something that's experimental and propositional. And Springay, Irwin, and Kind tell us that this research that is dedicated to perceiving the world artistically and educationally. It's the phenomenon of life that calls us to be engaged in artistic ways of knowing, being, and doing. So it's a different way of orienting to a phenomenon in an artistic orientation. So artographic research thinks in liminal spaces. In the article this week, the authors suggest that the outside is always the inside of another. So there's a relational quality to this orientation to research that situates knowledge as in between things. It attends to the intersections, overlappings of moments, and also of our roles as artists, researchers, and teachers. So it considers what exists in the space between the inside and the outside, interior, exterior, self, and other, where knowledge isn't situated at either end or a linear line, but rather it exists in the middle of things, between methodology and pedagogy, material and thought. Where research aims to cultivate knowledge that grows in the middle of things as an act of complication and complexity. So in this week's article, it's written that artography is a methodology of relational aesthetics, where patterns exist not as predetermined identities, but as co-appearance, a being with another. Meaning thus circulates, moving in all directions simultaneously. According to Nancy, this co-appearance is both unity and uniqueness, the singular plural of being. In other words, each individual identity is brought to being through encounters with other beings, and it is the width that maintains both contiguity and the distinctiveness of each pattern. So in an artographic practice, we're attending to the relational qualities of an experience. And we've been talking about this in terms of your living inquiry projects, that when you're attending to moments, in thinking about the art of paying attention, you're not only thinking about what it is that's happening, but you're attending to how these moments intersect. What are the multiple components or agents that are active in the moment? What's being brought into view because of these encounters and intersections, overlappings, and perhaps disjunctures as well? So thinking with this notion of relationality, an understanding of relational aesthetics appreciates that meaning is made not from the inside out, from the outside in, or from point A to point B, but rather meaning is made through encounters and interactions. That we're not only unpacking or deconstructing an idea, but rather we're engaged actively in making and remaking something. So something else is configured and something is made, something is becoming, and there's a connection to phenomenology here where research is not something done to, but rather it's cultivated with, in these liminal spaces between things, between self and other, material and theory. And with is a really important word here to consider, as with requires us to think in an encounter with another. Encounters exist in between parts, not to subsume the difference of the other into the same, but to become affected by another, where a capacity for movement is increased or decreased. And where the arts, for example, photography, writing, video, is situated within the event. It is living. And as the article suggests to us this week, it's intercorporeal, between bodies. And so it also considers stuttering, an overlapping concept that might speak well with our discussions a few weeks ago about silence, where we encounter the unspeakable, the ineffable, the inadequacy of spoken or written language, where we're called to pause and reconfigure ourselves in relation to an encounter that exceeds our capacity of thought. And this is where Elizabeth Groats writes, where language eludes a preconceived vocabulary and we're forced to reconfigure, to inquire. So as teachers and researchers, if we're able to pay attention and to attend to an encounter where something is affected in this moment, something becomes a little bit more complicated and perhaps we might respond to it. So we're looking for and assembling new patterns of meaning, not necessarily reproposing what we already know, but we're situating our thinking and our inquiry processes in those moments where we might be called to stutter. So in an artographic orientation, researchers and teachers consider that a concept is not formulated in isolation, but rather, as Deleuze and Guattari write, a concept is an act of thought, which emerges through an experimental doing. So in this way, artography is a practice that thinks, as Manning would say, and as such, it takes a significant methodological shift from the use of concepts to frame or prescribe methods toward a radically inventive pedagogy of the concept. So artography brings a commitment to illustrate meaning as an exposure that's never yet known, as Stephanie Springay would say, through experimental forms of art practice. So artographic research attends intimately to concepts that are made in the making, and they're emerging ontological formations. So how it is that they exist in the world and how they gather meaning in their existence. So these forms are never whole or stable or separate from the researcher. As we've discussed with regard to Haraway's work on feminist objectivity, both the researcher and her emerging conceptualizations are eternally partial, as we're in part and only a part of what it is that we're studying. So artographic researchers value their embodied implication in all facets of the research process and attend closely to sensorial affects of movement with materials. And they suggest that to see movement is to feel the body in relation to potential. And that's a quote by Rita Irwin. So artography has emerged as a creative practice, a research methodology, and a performative artistic pedagogy. So it's a process of inquiring that lingers in the liminal spaces between artist, that's the A, researcher, the R, and teacher, that's the T. And these forward slashes in artography aim to draw attention to interstitial states, movement, and the temporality of meaning as it forms through artistic practice. So unlike many arts-based research methodologies, which utilize art to signify children's realities or as representations of findings, artography reconfigures how artistic practices are applied in research and pedagogy with children, as it does not seek the portrayal of a subject, but more so a disruptive reconfiguration of it. So arts here are central in thinking and in doing, and as they are research in itself, not something to be added on or analyzed later. So artography is not determined necessarily by a set of processes, particular processes, but rather it acts as what Springe, Irwin, and Kine call a tangential thread that's been stitched and unraveled across multiple forms. Weaved across a variety of artistic disciplines, scholars have taken up artography to reconceptualize pedagogical practices through research with sculpture, with poetry, with textiles, visual arts, and other public art forms. So artography in this way is not a formulaic methodology. The process of art making itself, artographers are in constant relation with materials in ways which provoke difficult and complex questions that cannot be answered by straightforward or linear tellings. So artography aims to cultivate curiosities that are not yet known, areas of knowledge which stray from traditional regimes of representational knowledge toward more possible futures to expand, as Judith Butler would say, the very meaning of what counts as a valued and valuable body in the world. So in this way, artography requires a sort of loss of preconceived methods, where in absence, the effectual agencies and relationalities of materials become a central presence in the doings of art, research, and pedagogy. So Stephanie Springe articulates this centering of material relationality when she writes that in artography, the representation of research cannot be seen as the translation of experience. Instead, artographical research is as living inquiry constructs the very materiality it attempts to represent. So in other words, engaging in artographical research constructs the very thing one is attempting to make sense of.